Committee of the Whole.
The Committee of the Whole House on the State of the Union for the consideration of H.R. 467, which the clerk will report by title.
A bill to amend the Controlled Substances Act with respect to the scheduling of fentanyl-related substances and for other purposes.
Pursuant to the rule, the bill is considered read the first time. General debate shall be confined to the bill and amendments specified in the first section of the House Resolution 429 and shall not exceed 1 hour, equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Energy and Commerce or their respective designees. The gentleman from Kentucky, Mr. Guthrie, and the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Kentucky.
Madam Chair, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for the recognition. Action is needed now to address the fentanyl crisis. That's why I rise today in strong support of H.R. 467, the HALT Fentanyl Act. Fentanyl is the top cause of death for Americans 18 to 49 years old. In my home state of Kentucky, illicit fentanyl overdoses represented 70% of all overdoses in 2020 and 2021. The fentanyl crisis is one of the foremost problems that American public faces and is being made worse by the crisis at our southern border. Illicit fentanyl is turning virtually every community into a border community, with these poisons flooding streets across America and taking innocent lives, including the lives of our kids. The HALT Fentanyl Act would ban all fentanyl analogs and strip the drug cartels and other criminals of the incentive to create new versions of fentanyl to skirt around the law. This bill is a key step to help get these poisons off our streets and give law enforcement the tools they need to crack down on illicit fentanyl trafficking. A two-pronged approach to addressing this crisis is needed. We must have a law enforcement and a substance use recovery strategy to address this crisis. That's why I look forward to examining the Support Act for Patients and Communities Act later this year to continue providing access to treatment and recovery support services so that many individuals that they rely on throughout our country. To those who oppose this legislation on the grounds it could lead to mass incarceration, the emergency class-wide scheduling implemented by President Trump did not lead to mass incarcerations. In a Government Accountability Office study from 2021, the GAO found that there were only 8 prosecutions, yes, 8 prosecutions during the period in which the Trump administration temporarily scheduled fentanyl-related substances as Schedule I drugs from 2018 to 2020, with 4 of them being individuals working on behalf of the cartel because the cartels quit creating illicit fentanyl separate from the fentanyl that's poisoning our kids today. Which it could even be worse. I know there are also those who believe the emergency scheduling order didn't lead to reduction in overdose deaths, that this bill before us won't effectively address the issues we're facing. To both of those criticisms, this bill stops these analogs from being produced in the first place. Right after the class-wide ban was put in place, the number of fentanyl analog encounters dropped nearly 89%, more than 6,200 fewer reports of analogs. DEA officials stated that the class-wide scheduling contributed to this dramatic drop. It also includes provisions to facilitate more research into detection of fentanyl in substances and potential treatment of fentanyl poisonings, something that has much more red tape in the status quo. I'm happy to see the White House supports 2 main provisions of the HALT Fentanyl Act. The HALT Fentanyl Act is one step of many this body needs to take to address the end of the overdose crisis. The time to permanently act is now, and I urge my colleagues to vote yes on H.R. 467, and I yield back.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves, and the gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise in opposition to H.R. 467. I have deep concerns with the partisan approach my Republican colleagues have taken on this bill and the harmful implications it would have on our communities if adopted. The substance use and overdose crisis impacts all our communities, and the American people deserve bipartisan solutions that address both public safety and public health. This bill fails on both fronts and simply continues the status quo, allowing opioid use disorder and the overdose crisis to continue to devastate American families across the nation. In 2018, the Drug Enforcement Administration first issued a temporary class-wide scheduling order of fentanyl-related substances under Schedule 1, the strictest classification for drugs. Congress has voted to extend the temporary order multiple times, most recently in the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2023. But despite this action over the last 4 years, overdoses have not gone down, and we have unfortunately not made a dent in the incidence of opioid use disorders. Fentanyl and synthetic opioids continue to flood into the country. In testimony before our committee, the DEA administrator noted that DEA seized more than 50 million fake pills and 10,000 pounds of fentanyl in 2022. In other words, the HALT Fentanyl Act is a partisan distraction from the hard bipartisan work that actually has to be done to address a long-standing intractable problem that faces our communities. We lost over 100,000 people in 2022 to overdoses. This is one of the biggest public health crises our nation has ever faced. And now is not the time for a partisan approach. Now is the time for comprehensive bipartisan work. Democrats stand ready to work with Republicans on addressing the fentanyl crisis. We stand ready to work on permanent scheduling, so long as it's carefully designed to avoid exacerbating inequities in our criminal justice system. In committee, Democrats offered amendments to improve the HALT Fentanyl Act. We ask that Republicans consider additions to the bill that reflect the Biden administration's common sense interagency proposal. The proposal would permanently schedule FRS, but establish a set of guardrails that promise a scientific and equitable approach. The administration's proposal is reflected in bipartisan legislation that was introduced by Representatives Pappas, Gonzalez, and Newhouse, and includes an off-ramp to allow for expedited descheduling of FRS that are found to be either inert or have medical applications. There's already evidence that at least one FRS could have potential applications for reversing overdoses, similar to naloxone, and we must provide for such substances to be rapidly descheduled. The Biden administration's proposal also strikes the right balance on public safety by ensuring that permanent scheduling of FRS does not exacerbate existing inequities in our criminal justice system. It eliminates mandatory minimum standards involving SRS unless an offense results in serious bodily injury or death. Instead, the Republican majority has opted to continue failed punitive mandatory minimum sentencing that we know will disproportionately impact communities of color while doing nothing to address the underlying opioid crisis. And now as this bill comes to the House floor, Republicans are continuing to refuse to make this legislation better. Almost 90 amendments were filed for consideration on this bill, and Republicans ruled nearly all of them out of order, including the bipartisan Pappas amendment. An amendment from Representative Peterson of Colorado would have provided the off-ramp for rapid descheduling of FRS that are inert or have medical applications. An amendment offered by Representative Crockett of Texas would have ensured that federal law does not stand in the way of the use of fentanyl test strips, which are proven to reduce overdoses from fentanyl and FRS. Unfortunately, Republicans refuse to make any of these common sense amendments in order, despite the fact that they are clearly germane. And we simply cannot incarcerate our way out of a public health crisis. The HALT Fentanyl Act does not provide any resources for research or for prevention or for treatments, recovery, or harm reduction. It also does not provide law enforcement or public health agencies with any additional resources to detect and intercept illicit drugs entering the country. In fact, nearly every House Republican voted in favor of the Default on America Act, which would inflict devastating cuts that would force communities to lay off off thousands of law enforcement officers and first responders. And that's in addition to the significant cuts the Default on America Act would make to substance use programs that help treat patients in our communities. The reality is that this bill, paired with Republican efforts to slash vital public health and safety funding, will leave our communities worse off and exacerbate existing inequities in our criminal justice system. So, Madam Speaker, I can't support the underlying bill in its current form. I encourage my colleagues to oppose it, and I hope that at some point we can get back to doing some bipartisan work that will really make a difference in terms of this opioid and fentanyl crisis. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New Jersey reserves, and the gentleman from Kentucky
Thank
is
you, Madam Chair.
recognized.
This was a bipartisan bill. It got bipartisan votes in committee. The DEA's #1 priority. If you are selling fentanyl to our kids, you deserve to be incarcerated. We don't apologize for that. And I will now yield 2 minutes to the gentlewoman from Washington State, the chair, Kathy McMorris Rogers.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To save lives and make our communities safer, I rise in support of the HALT Fentanyl Act. Illicit fentanyl is one of the greatest threats that we face as a nation. Illicit drug manufacturers are diverting precursor chemicals from some of China's 160,000 chemical plants and shipping them to Mexico, where cartels are producing mass quantities of illicit fentanyl and fentanyl-related substances. These are being smuggled across our southern border and killing more people than ever. According to an analysis by the Washington Post, fentanyl poisonings is the #1 cause of death for people 18 to 49. I think about my friend, Molly Kane from Spokane. She lost her son, Carson. And Deb and Ray Cullen from Pennsylvania, who lost their son, Zach. Both Carson and Zach were killed instantly by substances laced with illicit fentanyl. Molly asked me, how many more letters from grieving parents is it going to take for action? The fact is, it shouldn't take another letter, another day. It shouldn't take another lost loved one. The HALT Fentanyl Act will save lives. We must make sure that law enforcement have the permanent tools that they need to seize these extremely lethal poisons. It is DEA's #1 priority. Without these tools, drug traffickers being sourced from China will be emboldened to push deadlier and deadlier drugs across the border. We can't let that happen. Let's come together today for a more secure future for every community in America. I urge support of the HALT Fentanyl Act, and I yield back.
I reserve.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves, and the gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I will yield 3 minutes now to a member of our Energy and Commerce Committee, the gentlewoman from Delaware, Ms. Lisa Blunt Rochester.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Ranking Member Pallone. And Madam Speaker, today I rise to talk about a public health emergency impacting every corner of our nation, fentanyl. As Congress debates the best approach to combating synthetic opioids, what we can all agree on is that every single one of us is impacted. And I urge my colleagues to keep our focus on the comprehensive and sustainable solutions. In 2021, in my small state of Delaware, we lost over 500 family members, friends, co-workers, and neighbors to overdoses. Of the more than 500 Delawareans lost to overdose, 80% involve fentanyl. Those numbers, unfortunately, are poised to get worse. As the former Deputy Secretary of Health and Social Services in Delaware, my career has made me look at these challenges through a lens of public health. That's why I was proud to join my colleagues, Representative Annie Custer and Don Bacon, in introducing the Stop Fentanyl Overdoses Act. Our bipartisan bill takes a comprehensive public health approach to reducing fentanyl overdoses by expanding testing, improving data collection and analysis, and expanding treatment for opioid use disorder. Our approach is supported by a broad and diverse coalition, including the Drug Policy Alliance, American Psychological Association services, and Partnership to End Addiction. As we continue to work to combat the fentanyl crisis, an issue that I know we all care deeply about, I hope we will keep a comprehensive public health approach top of mind. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman from New Jersey reserves, and the gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Madam Chair, I yield 3 minutes to the gentleman for Virginia, the bill's sponsor, Mr. Griffith.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Everyone in this body knows someone who's been affected by the drug overdose epidemic. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in 2022, there were more than 107,000 overdose deaths in the U.S. 67% of those deaths involve synthetic opioids like fentanyl. Right now, fentanyl analogs are considered Schedule I substances, but only because of a series of scheduling orders which expire on December 31st, 2024. Since we put that temporary order into place, we have seen a reduction in the trafficking of the fentanyl analogs into our country. According to a 2021 GAO report, fentanyl analogs coming into the U.S. dropped by 90% in the year that we did the temporary scheduling. This bill aims to curb overdose deaths by permanently scheduling fentanyl analogs as Schedule I substances. This will strengthen law enforcement's ability to prosecute fentanyl traffickers and act as a deterrent. The HALT Fentanyl Act also promotes research. This is something new. Research by removing barriers to the research. In the Energy and Commerce Committee, we heard that there are as many as 4,800 potential analogs. Our experts at NIH, FDA, and other agencies have studied roughly 30 of the 4,800. By encouraging research of Schedule I substances like fentanyl analogs, we can better understand how these substances work and how we may prevent potential harmful impacts in the future. Because fentanyl has a proven medical use, fentanyl itself has a proven medical use, it is considered a Schedule II narcotic. But illicit derivatives of fentanyl, also called fentanyl analogs, currently have not demonstrated medical value. Let me be clear. This bill will have no impact whatsoever on a physician's ability to administer fentanyl in proper medical scenarios. HALT deals specifically with fentanyl analogs, not fentanyl itself. The DEA has said that permanently scheduling fentanyl analogs is their top legislative priority. We must not allow this temporary extension to expire. On Monday, the Biden administration released a positive statement regarding the bill. In the statement, they supported the provisions I just described, permanent scheduling and streamlined research. The Biden administration did recommend a few other items they would like to see related to fentanyl analogs, and I'm open and willing to have these discussions, but that is not this bill. Madam Chair, we should vote to advance this bill that we agree on and that does help stop the bad guys, particularly those bringing these substances over the border. Once fentanyl analogs are permanently made Schedule I, Congress will continue to build off this work and continue to address the illicit fentanyl crisis. These large numbers that we've seen on fentanyl deaths and fentanyl analogs are because of these drugs coming across the border. They're 100 times more potent than morphine and 50 times more potent than heroin. Why would we not take every step possible that we can to stop it?
Is expired.
I yield back and thank the gentleman.
Gentleman reserves.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I know the Republicans have a number of speakers, so I'm going to continue to reserve.
The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Madam Chair, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Latta.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Madam Speaker, for over 2 years, I've worked with my colleague from Virginia's 9th District to pass the HALT Fentanyl Act. And during this time, our country has reeled from a record-breaking number of poisonings. In both 2021 and 2022, over 100,000 Americans died of an overdose. What was the main culprit? Fentanyl-related substances. In 2021, 77% of teen deaths were attributed to an illicit fentanyl poisoning, and it's now the #1 cause of death among adults 18 to 49. This crisis has simply spiraled out of control, and action must be taken immediately. That's where our bill, the HALT Fentanyl Act, comes into play. Right now, these fentanyl substances are temporarily set as a Schedule I narcotic. If this in this class-wide scheduling were to expire, drug traffickers would be given the green light to push deadlier drugs, law enforcement would lose authority to seize these deadly narcotics, and Americans will continue to die. I am pleased the House is taking up this bill to permanently place fentanyl-related substances as a Schedule I narcotic. I'd also like to take a moment to clear up a misconception about this bill. This isn't about criminal justice reform. This is about justice for the victims of fentanyl poisoning. Cartels are killing our citizens for 10 cents. Let me repeat that. Cartels are killing our citizens for 10 cents. That's how much it costs to make a pill in Mexico that's fentanyl-laced. The DEA's number one priority, we owe it, is their number one priority. We owe it to our constituents to fix this permanently. Currently, to trigger a 10-year mandatory minimum, an offense must involve 100 grams or more of a mixture containing a fentanyl analog. Because the average lethal dose of fentanyl is just 2 milligrams, again, just 2 milligrams, the offense would need to contain roughly 50,000 lethal doses. Again, that's 50,000 human beings that would be murdered from fentanyl poisoning. I strongly encourage my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support the HALT Fentanyl Act.
The gentleman's time has expired.
And to help end this crisis and save innocent lives. And with that, I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 3 minutes now to the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Summerlee.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I stand today in solidarity with the millions of black and brown folks who have been locked up over the failed war on drugs. I stand before you today some 50 years from the war on drugs and 39 years after President Reagan signed the Comprehensive Crime Control Act of 1984, which expanded penalties on weed possession, established mandatory minimums, and created civil asset forfeiture. 50 years since establishing drug policies that systematically led to the mass incarceration of generations of black men. But somehow this war on drugs will be different. Now, we don't always know the consequences of a bill like this, but with the HALT Act, we know. We all know. We have to listen to our experts, our public health, criminal justice, and civil rights organizations. They are on the ground doing the work in our communities, and 158 of them just told us that no, the HALT Act will not help the American people as this bill claims it would. It will only cause harm, especially to black and brown and low-income Americans. But we really didn't need the experts on this one. We've had decades to observe the effects of policies just like this. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different results. The HALT Act will do exactly what it was designed to do if we allow it to pass. We've seen 50 years of terrifying merry-go-round. The economy struggles, housing becomes less stable, and tough-on-crime approach is promoted as the solution. Lock up those most impacted, our siblings and neighbors struggling with addiction. Lock them up. Who is winning? Not the 350,000 folks currently serving time for drug offenses, not the families that have been torn apart by mass incarceration. Imagine the loss of generational wealth. Communities have been left without parents and grandparents, neighbors, leaders, and friends. The families who are mourning tens of thousands that have died every year from drug overdoses. Policies like this one do not lead to healing. They do not lead to safety, and they do not lead to justice, and we do deserve justice. We know there is a correlation between poverty and crime, not race and crime. We do not need tough on crime policies. We need to be tough on inequality. But for true systemic change, we have to be willing to consider different roads. We have to be willing to consider community-based, trauma-informed, and harm-reducing policies. We must resist the urge to hearken back to tough on crime rhetoric. Tough on crime is merely tough on community. We can do better, and we must do better. Then HALT Act. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield the remainder of my time.
The gentleman from New Jersey reserves, and the gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Billarakis.
The gentleman is recognized.
I appreciate it. Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I want to thank the chairman of the subcommittee. He's doing a great job, Healthcare Subcommittee. I rise today in support of the HALT Fentanyl Act. The American people in a midst of a staggering illicit fentanyl crisis, our kids are dying, Madam Speaker. We need to do everything we possibly can to help these kids. Sadly, we read daily headlines, Madam Speaker, of adults, teens, and even toddlers who have died from fentanyl poisoning. My colleagues across the aisle, they kick the can down the road. They've kicked it down the road too long, Madam Speaker, and look at the consequences. As fentanyl-related substances still remain only temporarily scheduled, the time is now to make it permanent. Today, we take an overdue step in the right direction. And as a proud advocate for individuals suffering with substance abuse, use disorder, I know this is just one step. Much more needs to be done, but thank you for bringing this bill up. I appreciate it. Sadly, we continue to see a huge influx of fentanyl-related substances into the country from across the Mexican border, from cartels using chemical imported from China and India. I'm disheartened to see communities across my state of Florida and across the nation bearing the ramifications of these criminal actors and our open border policies. We must secure the border. This is a nonpartisan issue, in my opinion, and we must come together to address the opioid crisis. We're at war with these cartels, Madam Speaker. I would like to see my Democratic colleagues heed the Biden administration's public support of these critical measures. Just this Monday, they issued their support for the policies in this bill, urging Congress to pass these measures to address public safety and save lives. So I say to my colleagues across the aisle, work with us on this and on other meaningful policy solutions to combat fentanyl in our nation. Thank you, and I commend the sponsors.
I continue to reserve.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 3 minutes now to the gentlewoman from California, Ms. Kamlager-Dove.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise today to strongly oppose the Republicans' HALT Fentanyl Act. Republicans want to ban American history so that they can repeat the bad parts. Did we learn nothing from the war on drugs? I guess not. Real talk, it was a huge failure. Back then, we enacted ineffective and punitive laws that only worked to expand mass incarceration, mostly of black and brown folks. This legislation will enact ineffective and punitive drug laws that only work to expand mass incarceration. Who will suffer? Mostly black and brown folk, while the data shows that all races are facing challenges with fentanyl. This legislation would put us on a dangerous path toward unjust and disproportionate mandatory minimums for the possession of all fentanyl-related substances. Newsflash, research is still needed on possible and legal pharmacological use of these substances, and fentanyl is still being prescribed legally and used in controlled settings by medical doctors. But that's right, Republicans don't like science. In its current form, this bill allows for no flexibility and won't address the root issue. This bill is short-sighted because some of these substances could still be key to developing treatment for fentanyl overdoses. So instead of learning about how we can save people from fentanyl, we want to criminalize all of the fentanyl-related substances. 97% of the illicit fentanyl seized at the border is seized at legal ports of entry. The majority of those convicted are U.S. citizens. The draconian mandatory minimums proposed under this plan don't address these issues. In fact, this bill doesn't do anything smart. It doesn't address the humanitarian crisis we are facing at our southern border. It doesn't address the epidemic of substance abuse, and it certainly won't improve our public safety. The majority of people who are dying from fentanyl are dying because they are taking it illegally. They are buying, searching for illicit drugs. It's not about prosecution. It's about drug use. The issue is substance abuse, and that's what we should be addressing. So if you're going to propose some legislation, make it make sense. Make it address root issues. Focus on the causes rather than continuing to scapegoat the same people that you have scapegoated for years and years to no end. I urge a no vote, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields. The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Madam Chair, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Indiana, the Vice Chair of the Health Subcommittee, Mr. Bouchon.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you very much. I want to point out this is fentanyl poisoning, and because people use illicit drugs, they certainly don't deserve to die from it. Mr. Speaker, I rise in strong support of the HALT Fentanyl Act. In 2022, roughly 75,000 Americans died from poisoning by synthetic opioids, largely illicit fentanyl or fentanyl-related substances. Illicit fentanyl poisonings are now the #1 cause of death among adults aged 18 to 49, as has been pointed out many times. The people who have died from illicit fentanyl poisoning are not just statistics. They're someone's child, sibling, parent, family member, or close friend. And it's happening in every community across America. It doesn't discriminate socioeconomic class, race, religion. Just last week, a federal grand jury indicted a man in Evansville, Indiana, my hometown, for selling counterfeit prescription pills laced with fentanyl over social media that caused at least 3 poisonings and the death of a 19-year-old woman in 2022. Last fall, a federal grand jury indicted another man in Evansville who sold fentanyl pills in 2021 that ended up killing a 3-year-old toddler and resulted in non-fatal poisonings of 2 other children in a home after they found illicit fentanyl pills in a nightstand and took them. These are heartbreaking stories, and we in this body have the power to do something to help prevent more of them from occurring. Let's pass the HALT Fentanyl Act and give hope to Americans whose family, friends, and loved ones who have been impacted by illicit fentanyl poisonings, that their loved one's death was not in vain. Support this bill. I yield back.
I reserve.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
I'm going to reserve at this time, Madam Speaker.
The gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Madam Speaker, I rise today in strong support of the HALT Fentanyl Act, which would permanently schedule fentanyl analogs as Schedule 1. Madam Speaker, the United States is facing a poisoning epidemic, and it's caused by illicit fentanyl and its related substances that are pouring over our southern border. Almost 200 people are dying every day from fentanyl poisoning. 200. Included in that number is a family from my district who lost their son Wesley to the drug at the age of 22 years. His mother writes, "My son was a victim of drug-induced homicide. He took 1 pill that ended up being pure fentanyl and died. He was poisoned because he trusted the wrong person and paid for it with his life. We cannot allow the lawlessness and tragedy to continue to tear our communities apart. That's why we must pass the HALT Fentanyl Act that is before us today. Opponents of this legislation are choosing to side with the criminals over the safety and well-being of our children. That is despicable. Madam Speaker, let's pass this bill, secure the border, stem the tide of the growing fentanyl crisis, and save lives. Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I yield back.
I reserve.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield 3 minutes now to my colleague from New Jersey, Mr. Payne.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank the gentleman from New Jersey for yielding to me. And I want to just follow up with the last 2 colleagues of mine, the gentlelady from California and the previous speaker. We cannot have what happened in the 80s and 90s of the scapegoating of communities with the heinous drug epidemic. It is interesting that now that fentanyl is impacting certain communities, now it's a health issue. But in the 80s and 90s, when there was a crack epidemic in urban communities, Nancy Reagan told us just to say no. Well, but here we are now in this day and age, and now it is a major issue. Why? Well, because it's impacting other communities that people tend to care more about their communities. What we're seeing now in minority communities was going on 20 years ago, and we were screaming, please help, please let's stop this scourge. But what we did was say, no, those people that are abusing those drugs are criminals, and let's lock them up. Mass incarceration. But now, in this day and age with fentanyl, it's a health issue. When the same thing was happening then that's happening now. I don't know how one is a criminal act and now we need to have compassion. But we do, because this country is suffering. Our young people are dying. And it is just unreal, the scourge that this drug is. But we have to remember that, that this opioid is such a powerful, fentanyl is such a powerful opioid that is 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. 2 milligrams, or the size of 5 grams of salt, 5 grains of salt, can cause a possible overdose. So we need to do something. Our young people are screaming out, they're crying, they're dying. But we cannot blame it all on the southern border. From time and time again, we have data that shows that 90% of the fentanyl is coming through ports of entry by American citizens. We need to address that. We need to talk about it.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Like another minute?
Thank you.
I yield another minute.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank the gentleman. The HALT Fentanyl Act is not the way to go. But we need to come together and do something, as this plague is ruining our future. I've seen it in my community. Others have seen it now in their community. We must come together with reasonable legislation. This is just another possible situation that starts mass incarceration once again. And I know I don't want to see in your community what that did to mine over the past 20 years, and I yield back.
The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Madam Chair, I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Florida, Dr. Dunn.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to express my support for H.R. 467, the HALT Fentanyl Act. This legislation will place all fentanyl-related substances as a class into Schedule I of the Controlled Substances Act. The Energy and Commerce Committee has taken an important step towards solving our fentanyl crisis, and I'm proud to have supported this bill since the 117th Congress. We've heard from the Molly Kane, we've heard from Cullens, countless others who've courageously told their stories of how their children were murdered by fentanyl. Make no mistake, fentanyl is a poison in our communities. Every pill, every toke, every line of cocaine is playing a game of Russian roulette every single time. This crisis is happening at the hands of bad actors such as the Chinese Communist Party and the drug cartels. And China remains the primary source of illicit fentanyl and its precursors that are trafficked internationally and through our porous southern border. In fiscal year 2023 so far, Customs and Border Patrol has seized over 17,000 pounds of fentanyl, enough to kill 11 times the entire population in the United States. The HALT Fentanyl Act is an important step in the right direction, and we must permanently schedule these substances. Let's call it what it is, a weapon of mass destruction. Our law enforcement officers fight heroically every day to combat this epidemic, and it is imperative that we protect them. I yield back.
I reserve.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I yield 3 minutes now to a member of the Energy and Commerce Committee, the gentlewoman from New Hampshire, Ms. Custer.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Ranking Member Pallone. Madam Speaker, I rise today to speak in opposition to H.R. 467, the HALT Fentanyl Act. The fentanyl crisis has touched every community across our state and country. We need to take serious bipartisan action to address this epidemic and save lives. Unfortunately, the legislation on the floor tonight misses the mark. The HALT Fentanyl Act does not address how these dangerous drugs enter our country, nor does it include any measures to address the underlying demand driving the substance use crisis. This bill simply preserves the status quo by continuing to schedule fentanyl-related substances as Schedule 1, which has been the case since 2018 and under current law will be the case until December of 2024. Scheduling alone will not change the overdose crisis. We need to broaden our scope. I urge this body to instead consider a public health approach to address this crisis. I am leading with Lisa Blunt Rochester and Don Bacon a bipartisan alternative bill that would address both the supply of and demand for illicit fentanyl in this country. Our bill, the Stop Fentanyl Overdoses Act, will enhance fentanyl surveillance through investments in technology, dedicate resources to strengthen law enforcement response, and improve data collection of seized drugs. The bill will also help reduce the demand for illicit drugs by expanding access to recovery resources, protecting people who administer opioid reversal drugs, and supporting education on the harm of drug misuse. The Stop Fentanyl Overdoses Act is an alternative to the scheduling-only approach on the floor. An issue this complex requires an equally comprehensive solution. Fentanyl doesn't care about our politics, and neither should our approach to addressing the overdose crisis. I urge my colleagues to consider my alternative bipartisan solution. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields. The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Madam Chair, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Arizona, Ms. Lesko.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Our nation is facing a tragic fentanyl crisis. Our kids are dying, our neighbors are dying, and the last 2 years, may I remind my Democratic colleagues that they were in charge. They were in charge of the House, they had control of the Senate, they had control of the presidency, and they did nothing to stop this fentanyl crisis. Late last year, I visited the Maricopa County Medical Examiner's Office in Phoenix, Arizona. It was truly revealing. It is one of the busiest medical examiner offices in the nation. And in Maricopa County last year, fentanyl and its analogs were involved in 60% of all the drug-related deaths. What's more, there are record amounts of fentanyl coming across our southern border into our Arizona communities. Do you know that last Thursday, officers at the Nogales, Arizona Port of Entry seized over 207,000 fentanyl pills and over 16 pounds of fentanyl powder just in one day? With border officials only able to seize 5 to 10% of all illegal drugs, these numbers are truly terrifying. House Republicans are taking action. We're the ones introducing this bill. We're the ones getting something done. We are introducing the HALT Fentanyl Act. And that's why I urge all of my colleagues to support this legislation to stop this deadly drug crisis and save lives. And I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields.
Reserved.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume. I don't like to disagree with my colleague from Arizona, who I respect, But she did say that when the Democrats were in the majority that we didn't address the issue, and that's not accurate. In fact, last Congress, we did pass out of the Energy and Commerce Committee a bipartisan mental health and substance use treatment package, H.R. 7666, which became law as part of the Consolidated Appropriations Bill last December. And that bill, H.R. 7666, that came out of our committee when it came to the floor in the House, was supported by over 400 members. Only 20 members didn't vote for it. And it was, as I said, later signed into law as part of the Consolidation Appropriations Act. And that new law includes the MAT Act and the MAID Act, historic pieces of legislation that ensure medical practitioners are prepared to identify and treat substance use disorders and increase access to medication-assisted treatment, such as buprenorphine. H.R. 766 also reauthorized billions of dollars in public health programs that address the mental health and substance use crisis, including both the Substance Use Prevention, Treatment, and Recovery Services Block Grant and state opioid response grants. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is the end-all. Obviously, more needs to be done. But part of what I think you're hearing from the Democratic side of the aisle today is that this legislation on the floor doesn't really deal with all these things. It doesn't deal with treatment. It doesn't deal with the border. It doesn't deal with law enforcement and more resources to address the fentanyl crisis. And we believe that a law that's going to really make a difference would do that. And that's the reason that we're saying that this that this bill that's before us, the HALT Fentanyl Act, really doesn't really do anything, because it just says that it's going to be in Schedule 1 beyond 2024. Right now, you already have these synthetic fentanyls scheduled in one until the end of next year, and we haven't really seen any progress with that. And so we would like to see a comprehensive approach that takes into account treatment that's a follow-up on what we passed in the last Congress. But I'll reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Dr. Joyce.
The gentleman is recognized.
I thank the gentlewoman for yielding. 6 months ago, I received an email from Ray Cullen, a resident of Franklin County, Pennsylvania, who along with his wife Deb had raised their kids in my district in Pennsylvania 13. Ray told the story of his son Zach, who last year was out with a bunch of buddies when he was sold cocaine that was laced with fentanyl. Unfortunately, a deadly poison that claimed Zach's life. Zach didn't know that the drugs that he and his friends had purchased were laced with this deadly synthetic opioid. Because of how lethal the drug is in small quantities, fentanyl has become the leading cause of death for Americans between the ages of 18 and 49. It was Franklin County Coroner Jeff Connor who put it so bluntly to me. He said, "Fentanyl is easy to get and it's fast to kill." The Collins reached out to share the memory of their son because they wanted to make a difference. They wanted to make sure that the pain that they were feeling was not shared by parents anywhere else in Pennsylvania, anywhere else in our country. Now, on the eve of the HALT Fentanyl vote, we in Congress have a chance to help prevent these needless deaths by passing the HALT Fentanyl Act, legislation to finally classify these deadly fentanyl substances as Schedule I narcotics. Deb and Ray Cullen have traveled and presented their case before the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee of Health. Deb and Ray Cullen will be here tomorrow. They will be in the gallery as we have a choice to make to vote in a bipartisan fashion to halt fentanyl and its deadly cause here in the United States. Thank you, and I yield.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I'll continue to reserve because the other side has a number of speakers.
The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, Mr. Garcia.
The gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. For too long, a lack of national leadership has forced law enforcement into navigating this fentanyl crisis without the proper tools or a defined mission. The HALT Fentanyl Act would provide both the tools and the mission by permanently classifying fentanyl analogs as Schedule I narcotics. This bill, which I've long supported, will mitigate this crisis by empowering police to use every tool available to get the traffickers of poison off the streets and put them in jail. Sell fentanyl, go to jail. Poison kids, go to jail. If you don't want to go to jail, don't sell fentanyl and don't poison our kids. Right now, we are failing as a nation. We're failing to recognize the severity of this crisis, failing to hold China and dealers accountable for their role, and we are failing to protect the people who most need it, our children. We've lost young Americans with bright futures like Daniel Perta from my district, who was a year away from graduating when he was poisoned by a counterfeit pill sold over Snapchat. For Daniel's memory and the memory of countless others, we must act. I urge support. 30 times the number of people who died on 9/11 last year died of fentanyl poisoning.
The gentleman's time's expired. The gentleman from Kentucky reserves.
Reserve.
The gentleman from New Jersey
I'll
is
continue to
recognized.
reserve, Madam Speaker.
The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Madam Chair, I yield 2 minutes to the gentlelady from Iowa, Dr. Miller Meeks.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague for yielding me time. I rise today in support of HALT Fentanyl Act, introduced by my friends and colleagues Morgan Griffith and Bob Latta. The fentanyl crisis is ravaging our nation, and there's no question this dangerous drug and its analogs should be scheduled. Fentanyl accounts for roughly 150 overdose deaths per day, and the number of deaths caused by fentanyl and other synthetic opioids is growing exponentially each year. The HALT Fentanyl Act would permanently schedule fentanyl-related substances and provide law enforcement with the tools needed to keep these lethal drugs off our streets. Should the temporary class-wide scheduling expire, drug traffickers would be empowered to ramp up their operations without fear or repercussions. At our border, U.S. Customs and Border Protection would lose the authority to seize these substances, and the amount of drugs coming into our country would skyrocket. It's hard to imagine the border crisis becoming worse than it already is, but should this scheduling expire, I'm afraid the crisis would escalate even further. And as a physician and the former director of the Iowa Department of Public Health, under whose purview substance use disorder and drug addiction failed, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle neglect that a vast majority of people affected by this are not drug addicts. One pill can kill. And furthermore, newsflash, this bill doesn't hamper any medical use, legal medical use of fentanyl. Fentanyl is not only more deadly than cocaine or morphine or heroin, it is significantly easier to produce and can be sold for 100 times more than it costs to make. Bad actors will always take advantage of bad situations, and this is no exception. I urge my colleagues to vote in favor of this bill to protect our most vulnerable populations and keep fentanyl and its analogs off the street. Thank you. I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields. The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Madam Chair, I yield 30 seconds to the gentleman from New York, Mr. D'Esposito.
The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 467, the HALT Fentanyl Act, of which I am proud to co-sponsor. I also find it baffling that speakers from the other side say that this does nothing, when in fact we are working to correct the wrongs of pro-criminal, open border agenda that Democrats have passed throughout this country. There is not one community across this nation that has been immune to the devastating effects of fentanyl. As an NYPD detective, I have witnessed far too many Americans destroyed due to opioid addictions stemming from this horrific narcotic, and Congress must act swiftly to combat the fentanyl epidemic. I urge all my colleagues to pass the HALT Act in order to make permanent class-wide scheduling order for fentanyl-related substances, which is the key to preventing unneeded deaths to relating fentanyl.
The gentleman's time has expired.
I yield back.
The gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Madam Chair, I'll yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Allen.
The gentleman is recognized.
Madam Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 467, the HALT Fentanyl Act. I am a proud original co-sponsor of this common sense legislation that would permanently reschedule fentanyl-related substances as Schedule I drugs. Far too often, we're hearing devastating stories from families across this great country who have lost loved ones to fentanyl and related deaths, and in many cases, it's our young people. Only a few milligrams of fentanyl can be lethal, which is why it is now the #1 cause of death among adults 18 to 49. Deadly fentanyl-related substances are being manufactured by China and the cartels and pouring across our borders into our cities, communities, and neighborhoods. We must ensure that our law enforcement and Border Patrol officers maintain the authority necessary to seize these drugs. That is why this body must take action to halt Fentanyl Act, and the HALT Fentanyl Act would supply law enforcement with the tools needed to keep this deadly substance off our streets. To put it simply, this bill will save lives. I strongly urge a yes vote on H.R. 467, and I yield back.
Time's expired. Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
May I inquire how much time my side has remaining?
Gentleman from Kentucky has 5.5 minutes remaining. Gentleman from New Jersey has 8 minutes remaining.
Mr. Chair, I yield 1.5 minutes to the I'm sorry. Switch the order on me. I yield 1.5 minutes to the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Kamek.
The gentlewoman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Today I rise in strong support of H.R. 467, the HALT Fentanyl Act. To drive home why this bill is so important, I want to emphasize that currently there is no permanent scheduling of fentanyl, only a temporary emergency scheduling order. That means when, not if, but when this temporary order on fentanyl expires, fentanyl-related substances will become street legal. Street legal. Think about this. Over 300 people a day will die today from fentanyl poisoning. 300 people died yesterday. 300 people will die tomorrow of fentanyl poisoning. If an airliner carrying 300 people crashed every single day, within the span of a week, we would have declared a national emergency and would have begun the work on solutions. But we haven't done that here. If we don't pass this bill when the emergency class-wide scheduling order expires, law enforcement will no longer have the authority to seize these extremely lethal drugs. Yes, you heard me right. They will no longer have the authority. As so many of my colleagues have said, today, fentanyl is the leading cause of death for individuals between the ages of 18 and 49, surpassing COVID, cancer, heart disease, and even car accidents. In fact, the DEA, Biden's DEA, y'all's DEA, says this is their #1 priority. Every single one of us knows someone who has been affected by fentanyl. Every single one of us in this chamber knows who is responsible for the fentanyl pouring into our country, and it is every single one of our jobs to act and pass the HALT Fentanyl Act. Let's put the politics aside, come together as Americans for our communities, for this country. I urge my colleagues to vote yes, and with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield my such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
I just want to correct the record, or at least set the record straight on what the DEA and what the Biden administration are saying. I heard what my colleague on the committee said, but I want you to understand that no one on our side of the aisle, and certainly not the Biden administration or the DEA, is saying that we should get rid of the current law, which says that synthetic fentanyl is on Schedule 1. I mean, that's been the case now. We've extended it for many times. As the gentlewoman said, it's actually extended until December of 2024. But what the Biden administration, in conjunction with the DEA, is saying is that before you go ahead and permanently extend, that you should look at some of the other things that we've talked about on the Democratic side of the aisle. In other words, they say in this task force from the administration with the DEA that there's a real possibility that research will find that there are synthetic fentanyl substances that might actually help deal with the crisis and reverse an overdose in certain circumstances. And so what they recommend is that we have an off-ramp to ensure that substances that are deemed to be to have a potential medical application are not improperly classified. Because if you pass this permanently, then you'd have to pass another law in order to take something off the list. Also, they're not recommending that we have mandatory minimum incarceration involving synthetic fentanyl unless an offense results in serious bodily injury or death. And this is what some of my colleagues on the Democratic side, that incarceration and mandatory minimum sentencing is not the answer. We know it hasn't been for years with other drugs as well. In addition to that, there should be funding to deal with the research, funding to deal with treatment, funding for law enforcement so they can prevent more fentanyl from coming into the country. And none of that is included in this bill. And so I just don't want my colleagues on the other side to misrepresent what DEA or what the Biden administration are saying. We all understand the nature of this crisis, but we don't think that this bill is going to do anything to change that, because it just basically extends the status quo, and it doesn't do anything for all these other things that have been mentioned on the Democratic side. And so I just think it's really important for you to understand where we're coming from on this. We don't disagree with the scheduling, putting this on Schedule 1, but we want to see a comprehensive approach, because what we're doing now has failed. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I'll yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Walburn.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
I thank the chairman. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 467, the HALT Fentanyl Act. A recent poll showed just 16% of Americans are satisfied with how things are going in the United States. Why? Well, Washington has largely ignored pressing issues in the past 2 years. While the fentanyl epidemic may not grab headlines in the mainstream media, who's lost the pulse of mainstream America, few issues are more important. Illicit fentanyl poisonings are now the #1 cause of death among Americans aged 18 to 49. Nearly every American knows a friend or relative who has struggled or even overdosed. I do. Despite the crisis, Congress has continued to kick the can down the road by temporarily extending the class-wide scheduling order. Each time, law enforcement is left scrambling as we approach the deadline, which would let many of the fentanyl-related substances become legal. We must permanently give law enforcement the tools they need to keep Americans safe. The HALT Fentanyl Act complements other solutions, like the recently passed Border Security for America Act, which will help properly root out the flow of illicit drugs and limit supply. I urge the bill's passage, which will represent another step toward restoring the voice of the American people in the House. I yield back.
I reserve.
Gentleman from Kentucky reserves. The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
I'll reserve also at this time. I think the gentleman has more.
The gentleman from New Jersey reserves. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Pfluger.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
I thank the chair. Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of the HALT Fentanyl Act, which will help end the thousands of deaths in this tragic situation. You know, I'm speaking on the behalf of parents like Joe Warnick and Donna Johnson of Odessa, Texas, who lost their son Jackson by fentanyl poisoning. I'm speaking up for thousands of families across the United States. How can you oppose this? Literally, how can you oppose this? Every day we hear more and more stories of lives ended by fentanyl, and it is our responsibility to act. The HALT Fentanyl Act will help end the fentanyl crisis by cracking down on criminals who are trafficking deadly fentanyl across the southern border and into our communities. It will ensure law enforcement has the tools they need to keep these extremely lethal and dangerous drugs off our streets. The moms and dads that I've talked to, they're tired of words. They're tired of words. They want action. And the HALT Fentanyl Act is the action that we need to take. Lives are on the line. I'm very proud of my Republican conference for proposing this legislation, and I urge my colleagues to support it. I yield back.
Time's expired.
I reserve and have no other speakers.
Gentleman from Kentucky
I have no further
reserves.
speakers. I reserve, but I have no further speakers. I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized.
And thank you, Mr. Speaker. I yield myself such time as I may consume, and I will be closing. My point that I've been trying to make, and my colleagues have been trying to make on this side of the aisle, is that Republicans continue to push punitive and partisan policies with regard to the opioid crisis rather than real solutions to address the substance abuse crisis, strengthen border security, or fix our immigration system. The partisan HALT Fentanyl Act would not meaningfully address substance abuse and would simply result in more incarceration. It takes a one-sided approach, this bill. by only requiring permanent class-wide scheduling of fentanyl-related substances in an attempt to incarcerate our way out of a public health crisis. And by contrast, the Biden administration has put forth an interagency proposal, which I discussed, to permanently schedule the synthetic fentanyl within Schedule I without exacerbating existing sentencing disparities and inequities in our criminal justice system, as well as creating an off-ramp to remove or reschedule these substances shown to have medical or therapeutic value. Now, I know that we hear from the other side, what have you done? What are you doing? Well, the bottom line is that the Biden administration has taken aggressive action to combat the overdose epidemic. Congress and the administration should be working together on a bipartisan solution to address the fentanyl crisis. But the Republicans are threatening a default crisis right now that would seriously undermine these efforts. Last year, the Biden administration announced its inaugural National Drug Control Strategy, which expands access to life-saving intervention like naloxone and buprenorphine, while providing additional resources to law enforcement agencies to intercept illegal drugs. To support this strategy and address illicit fentanyl, President Biden has called on Congress to make an historic investment of $46 billion in funding for efforts to reduce the supply of illicit fentanyl and stop drug trafficking, as well as expand access to treatment and prevention to reduce overdose deaths across the country. Now, at the same time, Republicans are threatening a default crisis unless Democrats go along with their drastic cuts that would seriously undermine our ability to combat the fentanyl and opioid crisis. According to the administration, the cuts demanded by Republicans would force the Border Patrol to axe more than 2,000 agents and drastically reduce funding for the DEA and the FBI. And these things are crucial to interdiction and anti-drug trafficking efforts. The Republican proposal, the Default on America Act, would reduce funding for treatment for opioid use disorders, resulting in thousands of more Americans losing access to treatment and recovery. It would also threaten to take health insurance away from millions of low-income individuals, including those struggling with substance use disorder and the opioid epidemic, and imposes a cruel and unnecessary work requirements on Medicaid. Now, all we're trying to say, listen to what we were saying on our side of the aisle, is this war on drugs, mandatory sentencing, incarcerate everybody, has not worked. It didn't work for other drugs. It's not going to work for fentanyl. At the same time, the Biden administration has put forward a proposal, and it's been put into bill form, the Stop Fentanyl Act, that looks at all this, tries to increase treatment, tries to increase interdiction and help law enforcement, tries to do more research to see to what extent we can find uses for synthetic fentanyl that actually will stop, if you will, or prevent overdoses from killing people. So we're just asking for a comprehensive approach. And I haven't heard anything from the other side of the aisle that says you're going to do anything more than continue with the current law, which says that we're going to make a synthetic fentanyl part of Schedule I, which is already the law, at least until the end of next year. So all we're saying is, let's sit down and actually try to come up with something here on a bipartisan basis that's going to make a difference for this fentanyl crisis. What we've done in the past hasn't worked. And if we're going to just reduce funding for all these things, that's certainly not going to work. That's only going to make it worse. So, I guess I'm just pleading with my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, rethink this. We have the time now to try to come up with a comprehensive approach that'll make a difference here. And if you pass this partisan bill, it's going to go nowhere in the Senate. It's not going to become law, and we will have accomplished nothing. So I would urge my colleagues to oppose this bill, and let's look for a comprehensive solution along the line of what the President has proposed. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Kentucky is recognized.
Mr. Chair, I yield myself as much time as I may consume.
The gentleman's recognized.
My friend from New Jersey did say that this law expires at the end of the year. That's why we're here today, to make scheduling fentanyl permanent, illicit fentanyl permanent. So we have to understand what the status quo is. The status quo currently is horrific, but before these illicit fentanyls were scheduled, although we couldn't get them permanently scheduled, there were all kinds of analogs throughout America, and that's why the DEA and the others recommended that we schedule these, because once you change the the fentanyl molecule, unless these are scheduled, then it's no longer illegal. And so these all appeared in our country. That's why we're reacting to it. And so they are permanently scheduled. They are scheduled now. And what we're moving is to make it permanent. So what's happened since they scheduled? They came to me and they said, they talk about mass incarceration. We've heard that today. There have been 8 people in prison under this law, 4 dealing with cartels, which I would say argue absolutely should be in prison. But so I asked some of my law enforcement people when I was looking at this bill, so if you've only arrested 8 people, why does it matter? They're saying on the other side of the aisle. But what they said was the only reason we've only arrested 8 people is because when this was put into place, the analogs, not fentanyl, but the analogs and the different that can be more dangerous have disappeared from the marketplace. They're bringing in fentanyl that is already scheduled. So the problem is if we treat fentanyl analogs different than fentanyl, that's why we have to put them in the same category, they're going to reappear again. Because if you have fentanyl subject to the final to mandatory minimums, but not these analogs, then they're going to reappear back on the case. We have to pass this bill. We have to move forward. And I recommend support of this bill. Now I yield back my time.
The gentleman yields back. All time for general debate has expired.